On the afternoon of the 10th of July in the city of Delft, a man climbed a staircase with 2 pistols hidden beneath his cloak. He had every reason to be there. He had forged papers and a story the household had believed for weeks. That he was a Calvinist refugee, a son of the persecuted, come to serve the great Protestant prince who had defied the King of Spain. He had been so convincing, he had seemed so poor, that only days before the prince's own household, apparently on the prince's own instructions, had given him money to buy proper clothes for church. He had used the money to buy pistols. The prince was William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, William the Silent, the man the Dutch would call the father of the Fatherland. For the better part of 2 decades, he had led the revolt of the Low Countries against Philip II of Spain. 4 years earlier, Philip had declared him an outlaw and set a price on his head: 25,000 crowns, a patent of nobility, and pardon for any crime to whoever would kill the man the king called a plague upon Christendom and an enemy of the human race. The man on the stairs, a devout young Catholic named Balthasar Gerard, had come to collect. William had just risen from the midday meal. As he passed, Gerard stepped out and fired at close range. The prince fell, and he did not rise. According to a tradition passed down for centuries, he spoke a few last words as he lay dying, a plea for mercy on himself and on the people he had led. Many modern historians doubt he said anything at all. The wounds were mortal and very likely immediate, and the famous sentence may be the work of memory rather than the record. But whether he lived to speak it or not, the sentence expressed the thing his whole life had come to mean. For 20 years, William of Orange had bound his own fate to the fate of the people who were not yet a nation, in a revolt that had not yet declared what it was for. And here's the difficulty the assassination illuminates. A cause that depends on a man is a fragile thing. Kill the man, and the cause may die with him. Philip II understood this perfectly, which is exactly why he paid so lavishly for a single life. And yet the revolt did not die at Delft. It outlived William by more than 60 years, and it produced something that neither William nor Philip had ever planned. Something Europe had never quite seen before, not a city-state of an ancient kind, and not a fragile experiment that flared and vanished, but a durable commercial commonwealth of merchants and provinces that governed itself without a crown sovereign, that tolerated the consciences of men who disagreed about God and grew so rich in the process that it became the wonder of its age. Last week, the resistance theorists showed us how a people may lawfully pull a tyrant down. This week, the Dutch showed us the harder thing: how free people build something in the empty place where a king used to stand. This is episode 7. This is the Dutch experiment. And I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 7 of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. And today, the Dutch experiment. This episode corresponds to Article 7 of our written series, published this past Sunday on our Substack page, and it is a direct continuation of where we ended last week. The Calvinist theorist, Beza, Hartmann, the author of the Vendici, Buchanan, they all had reasoned their way to a right of resistance. And in the Dutch Act of Abjuration of 1581, a people had finally acted on it, deposing their king in a formal declaration that reads across 2 centuries like a rehearsal for another one written in Philadelphia. But a right of resistance answers only half the question. It tells the people how to be rid of a tyrant. It says nothing about how they are to govern themselves once the tyrant is gone. The second demonstration was given not in a treatise, but in the mud and water of the Low Countries, by the very people who had signed the abjuration and then had to live with what they had done. This is the story of that demonstration, how a revolt became a republic, almost by accident. how toleration and commerce fed each other until a small waterlogged country surpassed a vast empire in shipping and finance, and how the men who built it also built, on the far side of the world, a machinery of conquest and slavery that was bound up with their prosperity and cannot be edited out. It is the last chapter in this series, the account of the Reformation and resistance, and it carries the argument to the edge of the English-speaking world where the next great advances in the theory of liberty were about to be made. As always, the podcast expands on the themes of the article, brings in additional primary sources, and addresses complexity the written format cannot fully explore. Let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore, always will.
To understand the Republic, you first have to understand the revolt that produced it, because almost nothing about it was planned. In the middle of the 16th century, the Low Countries, roughly the territory of the modern Netherlands and Belgium, were not a nation. They were a patchwork of 17 provinces, each with its own privileges, its own laws, and its own jealously guarded liberties. It was loosely held together under a shared sovereign and a thin set of common institutions. And through a long series of dynastic marriages and inheritances, that shared sovereign had become the King of Spain. When Philip II succeeded his father, Charles V, as Lord of the Provinces in 1555, he inherited one of the richest and most heavily urbanized regions in all of Europe. A dense belt of trading cities: Antwerp, Ghent, Bruges, Amsterdam, grown fat on cloth and shipping and finance, with a merchant population long accustomed to managing its own affairs and in paying for royal favors strictly on its own terms. Philip wanted two things from his Dutch subjects that they would not give him. He wanted their money, taxes to fund his wars, and he wanted their souls, religious uniformity. He was the most powerful Catholic monarch in the world, master of Spain and its silver-bearing empire in the Americas. And he regarded the spread of Protestantism in his northern provinces as both a heresy and a rebellion. To stamp it out, he pressed the enforcement of the anti-heresy laws he had inherited. He backed the machinery of the Inquisition, and he reorganized the church to bring it under his closer royal control. To the provinces, this looked like an assault on two things at once: on their faith, for the growing number who had embraced the Reformation, and on their ancient constitutional liberties. For everyone, Catholic and Protestant alike, who resented being ruled by a distant king and his foreign officials. Resistance built through the 1560s. A league of nobles petitioned the crown for relief, and a royal advisor dismissed them with a sneer as mere beggars. In French, gueux, a slur the rebels promptly seized and wore as a badge of honor. The sea beggars, they would call themselves, the privateers who carried the revolt onto the water. In 1566, a wave of Calvinist iconoclasm swept the provinces, mobs stripping and smashing the images in the Catholic churches. And Philip's answer was to send in an army. In 1567, the Duke of Alba arrived with Spanish troops and set up a tribunal the Dutch would remember by a grimmer name: the Council of Blood, which condemned thousands and executed leading noblemen. The revolt that followed was long and brutal, and more than once very nearly lost. It would drag on through truces and reversals for 8 years, until Spain at last recognized Dutch independence at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Let me give you just one moment from inside that war, because it captures the whole strange character of the thing. In 1574, the Spanish laid siege to the city of Leiden, and the city was starving, and the Dutch did something that only the Dutch in that waterlogged country could have done. They cut their own dikes. They opened the sluices and let the sea come in, deliberately flooding their own land so that a fleet of shallow draft ships could sail across the drowned fields to relieve the city. When the waters rose and the relief boats came, the Spanish broke off the siege and fled so suddenly that the starving townspeople found cooking pots still warm in the abandoned camp. And they ate the stew that the enemy had left behind. That is the revolt in miniature. A people willing to let the ocean in over their own fields rather than submit, impoverishing against a great empire with water and stubbornness and whatever lay to hand. And William of Orange became the leader of all this almost against his own temperament. He was not by origin a revolutionary, nor even a Calvinist. He was born into a Lutheran family in the House of Nassau, inherited the small principality of Orange as a boy, and was thereafter raised as a Catholic at the imperial court, where he became one of the wealthiest noblemen in the Low Countries and served the Habsburg crown loyally. What turned him was the combination of religious persecution and the trampling of provincial liberties. And once he had turned, he committed everything to the cause, his fortune, his family, and in the end, on that staircase in Delft, his life. He converted to Calvinism along the way, but his deepest political conviction was always broader than any single confession. That a ruler who governs by terror and forces the conscience of his subjects had broken the very compact that makes him a ruler at all. And that conviction, that exact conviction, is the thread that connects the man dying on the stairs at Delft to the argument of every single episode of this series. Now here's the part of the story that is most often misunderstood. And it is the part I want you most to carry away from this hour. In deposing Philip, the Dutch did not mean to become a republic. They did not intend to govern themselves at all. Think about how strange that idea would have seemed in 1581. Republics existed in the Europe of that day, sure, but they were mostly city-states and mountain cantons. Venice, Genoa, the Swiss. The notion that a territorial state of well over 1 million people could govern itself with no monarch at all was simply foreign to the political imagination of that age. The men of the States General did not reach for it because it did not occur to them to reach for it. In fact, the search for a replacement king was already underway before the Act of Abjuration was even signed. Nearly a year earlier, the provinces had concluded that a treaty with the Duke of Anjou, the brother of the King of France, who conditionally accepted the sovereignty of the provinces. The abjuration the following July simply cleared Philip out of the way to make room for his successor. The deposition, in other words, was not a leap into republicanism at all. It was one step in a search for a different king. And the search failed. It failed repeatedly. Anjou proved a disaster. He chafed at the limits the provinces placed on him. He tried to seize several of their own cities by armed force, and he had to be expelled. Then, after William's assassination in 1584, the provinces turned to Queen Elizabeth I of England. She declined the sovereignty herself, but she sent an army under the Earl of Leicester, and his governorship, too, was a failure. Only after these efforts had collapsed, one after another, did the provinces gradually and reluctantly conclude that they were going to have to manage on their own. The Dutch Republic, conventionally dated to 1588 when Leicester's departure ended the last serious experiment with a foreign governor, and the provincial assembly simply carried on without a sovereign prince, was not the fulfillment of anybody's plan. It was what was left over after every plan had failed. And I want to dwell on that because it matters far more than a historical footnote. The most consequential republic of the early modern world, the working model that Englishmen and Americans would later sit down and study, was not designed by a philosopher and was not dreamed up by a revolutionary. It was improvised by practical men who had run out of kings. And this is the lesson the series is going to meet in a different key at Philadelphia, that the durable institutions of liberty are far more often the product of necessity and compromise and hard experience than the theory imposed from above by clever men with a blueprint. So what did these practical men actually improvise? Something strange by the standards of its age, and the strangeness is exactly the point, so let me describe it plainly. The United Provinces were a confederation, not a unitary state. Sovereignty rested not in any single national government, but in the provinces themselves, 7 of them, of which Holland, which contained Amsterdam and the great trading cities, was by far the richest and most powerful. Each province governed its own internal affairs. Matters of common concern, chiefly war, peace, and foreign policy, were handled by a common assembly, the States General, in which each province had a single vote. And on the weightiest questions, unanimity was required. There was no king. There was no single executive with sovereign authority. There was not even a capital city in the ordinary sense. There was, however, an office called the Stadholder, and it is the piece most likely to confuse a modern listener. So let me be careful about it. The Stadholder had originally been the provincial governor who represented the sovereign, quite literally the king's man in the province. After the king was abjured, the office survived, but it changed its character. The provinces went on appointing stadholders, usually from the wider Orange-Nassau family, and they served mainly as military commanders and a focus of national unity. The stadholder was powerful, sometimes very powerful, but in the Republic's founding form, he was not a king. He held office by appointment, not by right of birth to a throne. He shared authority with the merchant regents who dominated the town councils and the provincial assemblies. And the whole long history of the Republic is in large part the history of the tensions between the Orange stadholders on the one side and the Republican merchant oligarchy on the other, over how much power each should hold. And that tension ran over the centuries in one direction. The office was left empty for long stadholderless stretches when the regents had the upper hand, but it drifted slowly toward dynastic and finally in 1747, formally hereditary status. A republic slowly growing a crown it never quite put on. And that merchant oligarchy is the other essential feature of the thing. The men who actually governed the Dutch Republic day to day were not aristocrats of ancient blood, and they were not royal appointees. They were regents, an urban patriciate whose families had, for the most part, made their money in trade and finance, and who filled the town councils, sat in provincial assemblies, and sent the delegates to the States General. Over time, this class hardened into a closed and self-perpetuating elite. This was not the democracy in any modern sense. The ordinary Dutchman had no vote in choosing his governors, and we are going to be honest about that when we reach for the reckoning. But it was self-government of a recognizable kind. And it was self-government by men whose livelihood depended on trade and property and contract rather than on land and title and the favor of a crown. And a state that is run by commercial men tends to make commercial priorities into public policy. Secure property, enforceable contracts, and a general disinclination to sacrifice prosperity to the vanities of dynastic warfare. So the Dutch Republic prefigured in practice something that later liberal thinkers would only much later articulate as theory, that commerce and liberty reinforce one another, and that a people secure in its property and free to trade will tend to prosper. But the most radical thing about the Dutch Republic was not its structure at all. It was its toleration. And to grasp how radical it was, you have to remember the age it stood in. The 16th to 17th centuries in Europe were the age of religious war. The premise nearly every ruler on the continent accepted, Catholic and Protestant alike, was that a state could only have one faith. That religious uniformity was the very foundation of political order. And that dissent was both heresy and sedition. The principle had a name in the Holy Roman Empire, its Latin translation, whose realm, his religion. The ruler's faith determined his subjects' faith, and that was the end of the matter. And it was in the name of this premise that the fires had been lit all through the last 2 episodes of the series. Catholics burning Protestants, Protestants drowning Anabaptists, and the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, the burning at Geneva. To be of the wrong faith in the wrong place was to risk everything. The Dutch Republic, almost alone among the great commercial powers of Western Europe, declined to enforce that premise. Now, I want to be careful and exact here because this is a place where the story is often told too simply. The Dutch were not the only refuge on the continent. Poland, Lithuania, and Transylvania had their own traditions of religious accommodation. But no state combined toleration with commercial power on anything like the scale of the Dutch. The founding compact of the Union back in 1579 had contained a genuinely remarkable provision that every person should remain free in his religion, and that no one should be examined or persecuted on account of it. In practice, the Reformed Church became the privileged public church of the Republic, and that position carried real advantages, but the Republic did not compel membership in it. And it generally refrained from the systematic, organized confessional persecution its neighbors practiced. It did not, in the main, kill people for what they believed. This was toleration, not equality. And it was uneven. Dissenters remained legally inferior. Enforcement varied sharply from one town to the next and from one province to the next. Fines and disabilities fell on those outside the public church. Catholics were forbidden public worship, and they worshipped instead in what were called hidden churches, plain house fronts on an Amsterdam street with a full sanctuary concealed inside that absolutely everybody knew were there. Their toleration rested much of the time on informal accommodation and a deliberate decision to not look too hard, rather than on any settled legal right. So do not picture a modern regime of equal religious freedom. Picture something rougher and a bit more begrudging than that, but something that, measured against the burning grounds of the rest of Europe, was nonetheless extraordinary. And the consequences, too, were extraordinary. Sephardic Jews fleeing the Iberian Inquisition settled in Amsterdam and built a community that flourished as few Jewish communities in Europe had for centuries. Persecuted sects from across the whole continent made their way to the Republic. Printers, forbidden elsewhere to publish what the censors would not pass, set up their presses in the Dutch cities and made the country the print shop of Europe, turning out books in a dozen languages that cannot legally appear in the lands they were actually written for. And among the refugees who found shelter there for a time was a congregation of English religious dissenters who had fled their own country's established church and settled at Leiden. The people history would come to remember as the Pilgrims. They lived among the tolerant Dutch for more than a decade before deciding to seek a new world across the ocean. What exactly they carried out of that Leiden decade, out of a society commercially advanced and unusually plural, into the institutions they later built at Plymouth, is something historians still argue about. And I want to be honest that the Plymouth settlers did not themselves go on to establish broad religious liberty. But they had seen, with their own eyes, a working example of many faiths living side by side. So why did the Dutch tolerate what the rest of Europe would not? Three explanations matter, and all three of them are true at once. The first is principle. The Dutch had the fresh memory of their own persecution under Spain. They had the influence of humanist and Erasmian traditions of moderation. And they had the conviction of men like William of Orange that the conscience simply cannot be commanded. The second is profit. Toleration was good for business. A trading city that turned away skilled and industrious men because of their creed lost their skill and their industry. They lost it to a rival city down the coast that would take them. Amsterdam grew rich in part precisely because it welcomed the very people other cities cast out. And the third is the one that is least remembered, and I think the most important of all. It is institutional. Authority in the Republic was divided among provinces and towns and courts and office holders so that no single power could impose one uniform confessional settlement, even if it wanted to. Amsterdam could behave differently from Leiden, Holland could behave differently from Groningen, and the gaps between those jurisdictions became the very spaces in which the dissenters lived. Toleration in the Dutch Republic was as much a byproduct of fragmented power as it was of enlightened belief. And notice, these three explanations are not in competition with each other. That is the lesson. A free society does not have to choose between principle and interest. Here, they ran together. And the division of power, the very thing that is so often lamented as weakness, as inefficiency, as a government too clumsy to act, that division of power can protect the liberty of conscience precisely because it prevents anyone at all from enforcing a single creed. And prosper the Dutch did on a scale that astonished their contemporaries and that still surprises people who encounter the figures for the first time. In the 17th century, its golden age, the tiny Dutch Republic became Europe's leading maritime and financial power and one of the foremost commercial powers in the entire world. And I want you to hold the improbability of that in your mind. This was a country smaller than many single provinces of its neighbors, much of it literally reclaimed from the sea. It had no silver mines. It had no vast territories. At the opening of the 17th century, it held perhaps 1.5 million people. And by the middle decades of that century, contemporary reconstructions place its merchant fleet above the tonnage of England, France, and Spain, the three great monarchies of Western Europe combined. Amsterdam became, in the phrase of the age, the warehouse of the world, the place where goods from the Baltic to the East Indies were bought, stored, insured, and resold. Dutch shipwrights built cargo vessels of exceptional efficiency and often more cheaply than any rival in Europe. Dutch traders moved grain and timber and salt and herring and cloth and spices across the whole known world. And Dutch financiers took the instruments of credit and exchange, the bills, the insurance, the securities, the deposit banking, much of it inherited from the Italian cities before them, and brought them to a scale and a liquidity that made Amsterdam the money market of Europe. This is the transmission thread this series keeps tracing, running now through commerce. The Italians invented the instruments, and the Dutch scaled them into the modern world. And the institutions they built were every bit as consequential as the wealth. In 1602, the States General chartered the Dutch East India Company, the Veneerie Oceantide Compagnie, and I know I mispronounced that, but bear with me. So from now on, I'll just say the VOC. And it granted it extraordinary powers, a monopoly on the Asian trade and the authority to build forts, to raise armies, to wage war, and to make treaties in the name of the Republic. It became the foundational model of the modern corporation, a large chartered enterprise with effectively permanent capital and broadly transferable shares that sustained an active secondary market. The ancestor, in other words, of both the modern corporation and the modern stock exchange. It was also a state-chartered monopoly, armed with the power to make war. It was no product of free and open competition. Keep that in mind. We'll return to it. But then in 1609, the city of Amsterdam founded the Wisselbank, the Bank of Amsterdam, whose reliability made its bank money a trusted international settlement asset, a unit of account for the wholesale finance of a continent, a reserve currency. So here's the demonstration all of this represents, and is the reason the Dutch Republic belongs in a series on the road to 1776. Here was powerful evidence, written in ledgers rather than in treaties, that a comparatively free, decentralized commercial republic could not merely survive alongside the great monarchies, but could actually outcompete them in shipping, in finance, and in the plain wealth of ordinary people. Spain had the silver of the Americas and a global empire. The Dutch had liberty and toleration and secure property and trade, and the Dutch grew richer per capita. The lesson that liberty is not only just but productive, that free men secure in their persons and their property will generate more wealth than subjects governed by command, is a lesson the American founders would absorb, and the classical economists would later formalize into a science. But the Dutch demonstrated it first, in practice, before anyone had fully explained it in theory. And a practical achievement of that scale produced, as such achievements often do, a thinker who tried to give it a principled foundation. His name was Hugo Grotius, and he belongs in this story for two reasons, both for what he argued and for what his own career reveals about the limits of the very republic that produced him. Grotius was a prodigy of the Dutch Golden Age, a jurist, a scholar, and a statesman who later wrote on law and theology and history with almost equal fluency. And his lasting contribution was to the theory of natural law and the law of nations. In an early work written to defend the seizure of a Portuguese ship by the VOC, he developed the argument that the sea itself could not be owned by any nation, that the oceans, by natural law, were free to all, open to the ships and commerce of every people. Mare Liberum, he called it, the free sea. Now, that was a doctrine enormously convenient to a trading nation that wished to sail everywhere and be shut out of nowhere. And I want you to notice what Grotius did with the convenience. He took the commercial interest of the Dutch and he elevated it into a principle of universal law. Keep that in view. It is the seed of the reckoning to come. But in his later great treatise on the law of war and peace, he went much further and much deeper. He argued that there is a natural law binding on nations exactly as it is binding on individuals. A law knowable by human reason and valid whether or not any earthly sovereign chooses to enforce it. A law that would hold its force, he famously suggested, even if one were to grant what could not in fact be granted, that God did not exist. And I want you to hear what that is because we have been listening for it all series long. That is the same natural law tradition this series has followed, all the way from Cicero through Aquinas, now turned outward to govern the relations of whole states, and carried by a man of the merchant republic. Grotius is a bridge. He takes the medieval inheritance of natural law and recasts it for a new world of sovereign nations and global commerce. And in doing so, he becomes one of the principal sources of the modern natural law tradition that Pufendorf and Locke and others would later develop and transform. The line from Grotius to Locke is not a single wire. It runs through Pufendorf and Hobbes and the late scholastics as well. But one important strand of the transmission this series traces passes directly through the Dutchman. But Grotius' own life exposes the fault line running straight through the tolerant republic. And it leads us now to the reckoning this episode cannot and must not avoid. Every week on Self-Evident, we go looking for the same thing. The moment an idea about human freedom first entered the world and the reason why it still matters to you right now. Here's how the week works, and starting now, there is something new. It begins before the week even starts. The Sunday before, we publish a written piece on our website, the deep version, fully sourced, for the reader who wants the whole argument on the page. That is where the week is anchored. Then on Saturday, we tell the story, the thinker, the document, the turning point, the history itself. From the ancient world to the founding, that is our historical episode. On Tuesday, we bring it home. We take that piece of history and we hold it against a debate happening in America today. Because none of this is dead, every one of these ideas is still being fought over. That is our contemporary Part B episode. And now, on Thursdays, we'll be adding a third voice to the week. We're opening the conversation up. For several of the weeks remaining in this series, the week will close with an interview, a real conversation with someone who lives inside that week's theme. Some weeks that will be a politician making the case from inside the arena. Some weeks a historian who has spent a career in the sources we are only visiting. An economist to sharpen the argument about markets and money and power. A business person who feels the weight of policy in a way the rest of us only read about. And a host of liberty-minded individuals just like you, just like me, who have thought hard about what it means to be free. Here's why this matters. History can feel like it happened to other people a long time ago. It did not. The fight over who holds power, whether you are free or governed, is the same fight. It just wears different clothes in every century. When you hear someone living a fight today talk about the thinker who started it 400 years ago, the whole thing comes alive. The article gives you the depth, the history gives you the roots, the application shows you the stakes, and the interview puts a living face on it all. So join us, read it, then watch it. Saturday, Tuesday, and now Thursday. Every week, one question runs underneath it all. Did this leave us more free or more governed? Let us go find out together. So I've tried with every episode this series to hold ourselves to the same discipline, a similar cadence, a structure. And with that, there is a portion that's called a reckoning. And for the achievements of the past to be honored, We must not conceal the failures entangled within them. And the failures are to be named directly, at full strength, without softening that turns history into flattery. That would be a disservice to this series and a disservice to you, the listener. We want you to understand the full case so that you can defend the case from all angles, as we do. The genuine contribution and the grave failure can inhabit the very same person, the very same society, and even at the very same time. And we can hold both of them in view without letting either erase the other. The Dutch Republic demands that discipline as much as any subject we have touched, and it demands it in two directions. The first failure touches liberty of conscience itself, the very thing we have been praising, because the toleration was real, but it was neither complete nor secure. And it failed conspicuously the moment a confessional quarrel broke out among the dominant Protestants themselves. We have already said that the Catholics and Anabaptists lived under restriction, tolerated but not equal, permitted to worship only in private, and shut out of public office. Toleration meant the absence of systematic persecution. It did not mean the presence of full civil equality. And the distinction matters. But the more revealing thing by far was what happened when the Reformed Church itself split. In the second decade of the 17th century, a bitter theological dispute between the two Protestant factions, the Remonstrants and their opponents, became fused with questions that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with power, whether the provinces or the States General held ultimate sovereignty. Who commanded the army? Whether a national synod could be forced on unwilling provinces. Doctrine, provincial sovereignty, and military authority melted together into a single crisis that the Republic's institutions could not settle by argument. And it ended with the state taking sides, and the losing party crushed. At the very center of that crisis stood Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. He was the land's advocate of Holland, the ablest statesman of the Republic's first generation, the man who, more than any other single figure, had guided it through the long search for a sovereign and out into its independent existence. He had led the civil government of the Republic for decades, and when the religious dispute became entangled with a naked struggle for power between Oldenbarnevelt and the Stadholder, Prince Maurice of Orange, William's own son, the outcome was not compromise. It was a purge. Oldenbarnevelt was arrested. He was tried by a special court of very doubtful legality, and he was beheaded. In 1619, an old man of 71 on a scaffold at The Hague. Grotius, his ally, was sentenced to life imprisonment and escaped only by being smuggled out of a cell hidden inside a chest of books. The Republic that had refused to burn heretics had just shown that it could still kill a statesman over a question that was, at the bottom of it, about God and power. And this was not a single aberration. The Republic's second great act of factional killing took a different and in some ways even more disturbing form. Half a century later, in 1672, the Rampjar, the year of disaster, when France and its allies very nearly overran the Republic, the state tore itself apart again. Johan de Witt, the grand pensionary who had led the government through its most brilliant years, was blamed for the catastrophe. And he and his brothers Cornelius were set upon by a mob in The Hague and murdered, beaten and shot, and their bodies mutilated in the street while the authorities stood by and did nothing to save them. Now hold the two killings side by side because they show entirely different ways that free institutions fail. Oldenbarnevelt was destroyed by the state itself through the forms of law, twisted to a factional end. The De Witts were destroyed by a crowd that the state would not restrain. The self-governing commercial republic, for all its toleration and all its prosperity, was vulnerable to both, to the abuse of the legal machinery from above and to the fury of the mob from below. Free institutions do not abolish the passions that turn men against one another. At their worst, they arm those passions, and they can also simply stand aside and let the mob do its work. That is a warning this series will continue to carry forward, and it is a warning the American founders, who studied the Dutch very closely, took to heart when they worried aloud again and again about faction and its dangers. The second failure is graver and more familiar because it is the very same failure this series will have to confront at its own center when it reaches the American founding. The prosperity of the Dutch Republic, the ledgers, the fleets, the Golden Age, rested most of all on the honest sources this hour has praised: the herring and the grain, the shipyards and the farms, the carrying trade of Europe. But it rested also on conquest and on slavery. The same VOC that pioneered the modern corporation ran an empire in Asia by force. In 1621, on the Banda Islands, the source of the world's nutmeg, the company's Governor-General, Jan Pieterszoon Koon, resolved to break the islanders' resistance to the Dutch trade monopoly once and for all. His forces killed, enslaved, deported, or drove into flight almost the entire population of those islands, a community of some 15,000 people, reduced to perhaps 1,000, and then repopulated the empty land with plantation labor, much of it enslaved, to work the nutmeg groves for Dutch profit. It was, by any honest measure, a massacre carried out to secure a trade monopoly. And some recent scholarship, including Frank Daunt's contribution to the Cambridge World History of Genocide, classifies the campaign as exactly that, a genocide. And across the Atlantic, the Dutch took their place among the slaving nations, their West India Company carrying human beings across the ocean as cargo, trafficking in the very same commerce in men that would stain every European power that ever touched the New World. There is no way to tell the story of Dutch liberty that quietly cuts this out. The point is not to cancel the achievement. The point is to see it whole. And now, as is also consistent within our series, the strongest case against the argument of this episode, stated at full strength. The claim of this hour has been that the Dutch Republic was a genuine advance in the practice of liberty and a working model that fed the tradition running toward 1776. But there are two objections that press hard against that claim, and each one deserves a full statement. The first objection is that calling the Dutch Republic a triumph of liberty flatters it beyond what it deserves. Self-government, the skeptic says, was self-government by a narrow merchant caste. The regents were a closed, self-perpetuating elite who filled their own councils and answered to no electorate at all. The ordinary Dutchman, the sailor, the weaver, the farmhand, had no more voice in choosing his governors than a French peasant had in choosing his. And beneath the merchant oligarchs, the whole glittering wealth of the Golden Age rested on the labor of the poor at home and the enslaved labor abroad. To call this arrangement self-government and to set it on some honored road to 1776 is to mistake the liberty of a prosperous few for the liberty of a people. That objection lands, and it should not be dodged. The Dutch Republic was an oligarchy, and its liberty was distributed with gross unevenness. But the reply is not to deny any of that. The reply is to measure the republic against the alternative that actually existed, which was not modern democracy, but early modern monarchy. Set this state beside the absolutism of Philip's Spain or Louis's France, a state in which sovereignty rested with assemblies of towns and provinces rather than with a crowned sovereign. A state in which power was divided among the provinces and shared among many hands. A state in which no man ruled by divine right, and in which systematic confessional persecution was markedly less extensive than most of the monarchies around it. Such a state was a real and substantial advance of liberty, even if that liberty was not yet universal. And here's the thing to see. Almost every advance this series has traced was, in its own moment, incomplete. Athenian liberty excluded slaves and women. Magna Carta secured the barons before it reached anyone else. The liberty of the Dutch regents was broader than the liberty of Philip's subjects, and it was narrower than the liberty we would demand today. The thread widens as it runs. That it had not yet reached its full width in Amsterdam in 1650 is no reason at all to deny that it actually still ran there. And the second objection cuts at the achievement this hour has most praised: Dutch toleration. The skeptic argues Dutch toleration was never a principled commitment to liberty of conscience at all. It was a commercial calculation, a policy adopted because it turned a profit, extended only just as far as the profit required, and abandoned the very moment it became inconvenient. And the objection, the skeptic says, is the Oldenbarnevelt affair itself. The instant a confessional quarrel among the dominant Protestants first threatened the state, the tolerant republic tried, imprisoned, and executed men. And a struggle shot through with doctrine, exactly as the intolerant states all around it did. Toleration that collapses the moment it is put under pressure was never conviction. It was convenience wearing the mask of principle. This is the sharper of the two objections, and honest reply concedes a great deal of it. Much of Dutch toleration was indeed programmatic, and it did buckle badly under the crisis. But two things have to be said against the conclusion the skeptic draws from all of that. The first is that the origin of a practice does not determine its worth. A toleration adopted for profit still spared real people from real fires. The Sephardic Jew of Amsterdam and the Pilgrim of Leiden were no less unburned for the fact that their host held a commercial motive for not burning them. A liberty that begins as a calculation can harden over generations into custom and then into principle. And the plain habit of not persecuting your neighbors is a habit richly worth having, however it happens to start. And the second thing is this: the fact that Dutch toleration was imperfect and sometimes failed does not set it apart from every other advance in the series. It places it squarely among them. The question was never whether the Dutch achieved a perfect liberty of conscience. Nobody in the 17th century did. The question is whether they built one of the broadest and most durable regimes of practical toleration in all of Western Europe. And that they did. That is precisely why the persecuted came to them and not the other way around. And there's still a third doubt worth naming, if only to set it fairly in its place: the doubt that the whole notion of Dutch influence on the American founding is overstated. That 1776 owed little or nothing to Amsterdam. And that is true that the lines of influence here are diffuse and genuinely hard to quantify, and I have not claimed to you tonight that the founders simply copied the Dutch. What I have claimed is narrower and firmer: that the Dutch Republic was the great working example of what the resistance theorist had argued in principle: a modern people governing itself, tolerating its dissenters, and prospering without a king. And that educated men in England and America knew it and studied it and drew from it. The abjuration's kinship with the Declaration, the Pilgrim's Decade at Leiden, the explicit examination of the Dutch Confederation by American constitutional writers during the founding and the ratification debates, these are not the whole of the American inheritance, but they are a real strand of it. And here's the point I especially want you to sit with. The founders learned from Dutch failure every bit as much as from Dutch success. In the 20th Federalist Paper, published as the states were debating the new Constitution, Madison and Hamilton dissected the United Provinces at length, not as a model to copy, as a cautionary tale of a confederation crippled by divided sovereignty, by the requirement of unanimous consent, by a central government simply too weak to govern. A confederacy of republics, they wrote, or rather of aristocracies, impressive but constitutionally defective. The Dutch did not write the American creed, but they offered the modern world one of its clearest early demonstrations that a substantial commercial people could govern itself without a crowned sovereign. And, as those later readers saw so clearly, a standing warning of what divided sovereignty and an entrenched oligarchy could cost. And one last consistency piece for us, of course, the liberty test. Our recurring tool, the plain question of whether a given arrangement leaves a people more free or more governed. And apply it to the thing that was strangest and most quietly instructive about the Dutch settlement, the division of power itself. Remember what we found in the middle of this episode. The Dutch did not tolerate their dissenters only out of high principle and not out of profit. They tolerated them in large part because no single power in that fragmented republic was strong enough to stamp out dissent even if it had wanted to. Authority was scattered across 7 provinces, across the towns, across the courts and the office holders, and the gaps between all those jurisdictions became the spaces where free men could live. Now we are trained, most of us, to see divided and clumsy government as a defect, as gridlock, as a machine too broken to do what it needs doing. But the Dutch experiment whispers something else, something the American founders would build into their whole design, that the division of power is not only a check on tyranny in the abstract, it is, very concretely, the thing that shelters conscience, because it prevents any one hand from ever closing around every throat at once. A people whose power is gathered into a single place may be governed efficiently, but it had better hope every single day that the single hand holding all that power stays gentle. The Dutchman outside the public church did not have to hope. He had somewhere else to stand. And now the honest present-day question, and I'm going to leave it genuinely open because it is genuinely hard. In our own moment, we have spent the better part of a century gathering power upward and inward, toward the center, toward the single hand, in the name of efficiency and uniformity, and getting things done. So the Dutch put the question to us squarely. When we consolidate authority, when we sweep away the friction of the provinces, of the towns, and the overlapping jurisdictions, and concentrate the decision in one clean place, are we making ourselves more free or more governed? And there is a second half to the question, which the Dutch answer more darkly, and which we should not look away from. Their own republic, for all its scattered power, drifted over time toward concentration, toward the Stadholder, toward the crown and never quite put on, which should suggest that a fragmented, liberty-protecting arrangement is not a stable resting place. It is a thing that has to be actively held, because the pull, always and everywhere, runs the other way, toward the center, toward the single hand. This is the true inheritance of the Dutch experiment, made present. Not a slogan against government, a hard demonstration that the division of power and the freedom of conscience are bound together far more tightly than we tend to remember, and that arrangement which protects them does not hold itself. The revolt that began as a defense of provincial liberties against a foreign king had produced something its own leaders never once set out to build: a durable, tolerant, prosperous republic that governed itself without a crown and became for a century one of the richest societies in Europe and among the most free and religiously plural of all its political orders. It was the practical answer to the question the resistance theorists had left hanging in the air, not only how to be rid of a tyrant, but how to live once it's gone. And the Dutch answered that question not with a theory, they answered it with a country. And that answer closes the series account of the Reformation and the theory of resistance. Arc 2 is complete. We have watched persecuted jurists build a doctrine of lawful resistance in the shadow of a massacre. And now we have watched a nation of merchants take that doctrine and make of it a working republic. The scene now shifts across the North Sea to England, where the next great advances in the argument for liberty were about to be made. Not by merchants improvising a state, but by lawyers and parliaments and revolutionaries, wrestling with a crown that claimed far more than the ancient constitution had ever allowed it. The Dutch had shown the world what free people could build. The English were about to work out in courtrooms and on battlefields, and finally on a scaffold before the king's own palace, the terms on which a free people could hold even their own government to the law. Because across the Golden Sea, English lawyers and English political writers could watch both the achievements and the constitutional struggles of the Dutch Republic, and among those Englishmen were the lawyers who would insist that even the king is under the law, that there is an ancient constitution older than any Stuart claim, and that there is a common law that no crown on earth may override. To one of those lawyers and to the whole tradition he defended, this series turns next. This is the road to 1776, and now it runs through the courts of England. Next Saturday, in episode 8, the series crosses the North Sea to England, and to the man who told his own king to the king's face that the common law would control the acts of the crown, Sir Edward Coke, Having watched the Dutch build a republic without a king, we turn to the English struggle to bind a king very much who remained on his throne, to the ancient constitution, to the common law, and to the long fight to establish the law, that the law stands above the man who wears the crown. This is where the road runs next. And this coming Tuesday, in our contemporary application episode, we take the inheritance of this hour and hold it against our own moment, toleration and its limits, the fragile relationship between divided power and the freedom of conscience, and the hard questions of what a free people loses when it gathers all of its authority into a single hand. And again on Thursday, we have a capstone for the week with an interview with United States congressional candidate Jamie Frost Remy out of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It should be an interesting one. I am Jeff Gellick, and this has been episode 7 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all the written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions and exclusives, as well as all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.